around this. The Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana saying in an interview on Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405, that he doesn't believe there's enough money in government to continue to pay the social relief of distress grant forever. He's also said that if there was no SRD grant, then he would not have to increase VAT. It's still not clear, of course, of whether the major partners in the coalition government, I suppose essentially the ANC and the DA, have agreed on a budget which is due to be presented on Wednesday after being postponed several weeks ago. Neil Coleman, Senior Policy Specialist and one of the founding co-directors of the Institute for Economic Justice. Neil, good morning to you. Now, economics is often presented as being about trade-offs. Is there a trade-off here between the SRD grant and a VAT increase, as the Minister claims?
No, Stephen. He actually, I'm afraid to say, is misleading the country, deliberately misinforming the country. He was in Parliament on the 31st of October last year with his Director General, and they were responding to questions on the medium-term budget policy statement. And the Director General outlined that the SRD grant was provided for in the 2025 baseline. In other words, the SRD grant is already financed in this year's budget. It is not an additional item. That was confirmed by the Director General. It's under the provisional item in the medium-term budget policy statement, an item which provided for, I think it was 46.1 billion, of which 35 billion has been allocated. So there's no trade-off. The only trade-off would come if the SRD grant, as it is supposed to do in terms of the High Court decision in Pretoria, was extended to the millions of people who are currently being excluded and was increased to keep pace with inflation and to link to the food poverty line. So that's a trade-off. There's no trade-off with the current budget shortfall. The budget shortfall is actually 32 billion, not the amount that we're being told, because as I've explained, the SRD grant is already catered. So it's extremely unprincipled to focus on the poorest members of society and say, listen, accept the VAT increase, otherwise we're taking away your SRD grant. That is not a trade-off. That's just sheer misinformation.
Okay, I mean, it's a big accusation. As you say, you have evidence to say that the Finance Minister is lying, and I would suspect he'll have a robust defence to that at some point, if he does choose to. The argument, I suppose, would go, though, that there have been several financial shocks. The one is the judgment, the SRD judgment that you refer to in the High Court in Tswana. The other is the decision by the US government, well, I suppose really the decision by President Donald Trump, to cut PEPFAR funding. So certainly there is less money available than perhaps the Minister thought would be available at the beginning of the year. I presume it's fair to say that. Where should that money then come from? How should we make up that shortfall?
Sorry, Stephen, it's not fair to say that. This is just incompetence on the part of the Minister and Treasury. They failed to budget for items that were easily anticipated. It has nothing to do with PEPFAR. It relates to the question of increases in social grants, health expenditure, education expenditure, and so on, which have been cut to the bone in the last number of years. And they realized that they couldn't keep on cutting back. Revenue has actually exceeded what was projected in 2024. So it can't be claimed that there's a shortfall that was unanticipated. The PEPFAR issue is a separate issue which has only come up in the last little while and is a relatively small amount that we're talking about. So this is incompetence. It's manipulative. It's trying to make choices, to force people into choices which are unnecessary, to make the poor sacrifice in whatever way you cut it, either to have cutbacks in allocations which benefit them, or to have taxes imposed which place a burden on them. Now, our Institute for Economic Justice, and other experts have shown that there are multiple alternatives in terms of revenue raising. If you remember, in 2023, the Minister and Treasury told us that we were facing bankruptcy, a fiscal crisis. And they issued an edict to say that all state institutions needed to cut across the board. This is outside of the budget provisions. because of this so-called crisis. The Institute pointed out that we have this massive fund in the Reserve Bank that owes large amounts of money, that 500 billion in this fund, the JFECRA, we were told this is not available, etc. The next year, the Minister in Treasury made provision for 150 billion of that fund to be put into retiring the debt. So this is just one of the options that is available to the state. Multiple other options have been raised in terms of cutting back on wasteful expenditure, in terms of raising funds via multiple means. So the trade-offs, as you call it, Stephen, are being made in ways which disadvantage the poorest and most vulnerable in society, because those with power and those with the ability to push policymakers in certain directions are not prepared to make the sort of sacrifices that are required in the country. And this is why one good thing that we've had emerging out of this crisis is that it's opened up the budget debate in a way that hasn't happened before. And I anticipate that when the budget is presented on Wednesday by the minister, there is going to be a robust debate, and it's not going to be smooth sailing. And the country needs to now become involved in this discussion.
Sure. Neil, yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have let you speak for some time. I mean, I agree with you. I think there is going to be a robust debate. I think there you and I would agree. Cutting back on government expenditure, I mean, it would seem, I think, almost obvious to most people that government does not spend its money wisely. I mean, Joburg has a budget of 83 billion rand, and I honestly cannot tell you what it is spent on in any productive fashion. You could say the same for the seaters. People have picked on the seaters, for example, quite recently. Are there places where we can cut back? Let me put this to you. Let me put this to you in another way. Is this a moment where we should start a debate for zero-based budgeting? In other words, we start again.
So, Stephen, I wrote an article on this issue of zero-based budgeting a couple of years ago. The idea of zero-based budgeting in principle is not a bad idea, because what it says is that we go back to the beginning and we say, where do we need to spend more? Where have we got a shortage of teachers, of nurses, of essential services? And we've seen this in multiple departments, actually, that there's an underspending. And where is there wasteful expenditure? Let's have an open, but it must be an evidence-based debate. It cannot be a fig leaf for austerity, for cutting back. And that is a genuine zero-based budgeting exercise. I have no problem with that, but then it must be based on expert advice. It must be based on objective scientific evidence. And what you will find, Stephen, is that once you do that exercise, there's certain areas where certainly one can cut back, but there's certain areas where a very significant increase in spending is required, particularly in the areas of critical public services, in the areas of social grants, where people are facing extreme hunger, and the list goes on. So this is not a simple exercise. It's something that requires serious thought, and it requires serious capacity in order to do that. The mantra of the DA of, we've got to cut back on this and cut back on that. And it's not their constituency that is going to suffer as a result of that. There has to be a recognition that there is a serious impact that austerity over the number of years and the cutbacks have had on services for the majority. And therefore, that needs to be put into the pot equally. The question of cutting back on deputy ministers, etc., cutting back on unnecessary spending, everyone will agree with that. That is something that is required. That is something that is important. But actually, in the scheme of things, it's going to be a relatively small amount. We need to mobilize our domestic resources much more effectively. Yes, we need to cut back on wastage, but we also need to allocate these resources in areas where there are serious shortfalls currently, and one can do that audit quite easily.
Neil Coleman, thank you. Senior Policy Specialist and one of the founding co-directors at the Institute for Economic Justice. Do appreciate that.